Great Minds on Learning is supported by Talent Desk, one centralized place to onboard, manage and pay all your freelancers and vendors seamlessly and compliantly.
Oh no. No. With Talent Desk, you get seamless freelancer management, so you have time to make yourself that well-deserved cup of joe without losing your mind.
Visit talentdesk.io/greatminds and get 1 month free. Plus, more time for coffee. Great Minds on Learning is sponsored by the Learning Technologies Awards 2025.
When they announced the gold winner, we were, it's us. Wow.
It was really a very, very special moment.
It meant so much to win this award. It was a really proud moment for all of us.
The Learning Technologies Awards brings together the best in global learning technologies. It's a highly prestigious recognition of achievement and innovation.
Quality is very, very important, and learning technologies have got such an amazing reputation for quality.
They're really rigorous. They're not sort of just handed out. You really have to demonstrate that this course has made an impact.
Winning can change lives, build careers, and turbo boost learning in your organisation.
Winning the award has brought a lot of recognition to our team, and it's really validated a lot of the things that we're doing for the group. It is such lovely validation.
Basically, this confirmation that we're on the right track, that it makes impact, and that we're able to expand.
Apply today at learningtechnologiesawards.co.uk.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to Great Minds on Learning. In this acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of learning theory, from the Greeks to the geeks. In this episode, we meet some critics of higher education, figures who questioned its value, purpose, and outcomes. Is university a pathway to enlightenment and opportunity, or, as some claim, an overpriced signalling machine churning out debt-laden graduates for a saturated job market? This group of thinkers come from highly diverse backgrounds and include an economist, a professor of linguistics, a tech investor, and a former Prime Minister of the UK, among others. What is higher education for, they prompt us to ask, and who is it really serving?
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning, everybody. You find us glowing with pride, having received a very positive bit of feedback to our last show on critical pedagogues. This came from Carl Hendrick, a professor of applied sciences. Really enjoyed listening to this latest episode of what is becoming a really valuable body of work. And I mean, that's nice. We do get a lot of kind of plaudits for the series, but the idea that people appreciate the fact that it's a valuable body of work that, with a bit of shelf life that we're producing here is good. We're not just, as my daughter would say, chatting wires and sort of making each other laugh at the expense of the world's greatest minds. So thank you, Carl, for that. I should explain as well that Donald appears to have a head injury. This is not because of negative feedback we had on that last episode. I must say I had a few sleepless nights about the subject before we went into it. I haven't been cancelled yet, so far as I know. Donald, you were cancelled a long time ago. But the head wound is due to an argument with a bike rat, and Donald is joining us from his mobile home, won't call you trailer trash, and in Scotland. A very peripatetic lecturer we have here with us today. So let's hope that the latest addition to that body of work we're recording today will be equally valuable. This time we're covering critics of higher education, a group of people who have at various times and in very different ways applied critical thinking to the structures and institutions of higher education. Some famous names here, a pretty varied bunch. Donald, what's the story you're going to be telling us in this episode?
Yes, that's right, John. I'm in a camper van in the middle of bonny Scotland with my injury, as it were. But I suppose it's slightly relevant to try and segue into something that's relevant in being a camper van. And in that this episode is about higher education, and in a sense, there's a matter of timing here. I mean, I think few would argue that higher education is going through a sort of several crises. funding crises, there are, huge deficits, political crisis, attacks from various quarters, an assessment crisis around AI and plagiarism, and maybe also, I would say, a crisis of relevance. There's a real questioning about whether it's lost its way or has retained its true purpose. So I think that's really what this is about, that mixture of things. And I've tried to choose a selection of people. I don't want it to be just sort of let's rip into higher education type episode. That would be a mistake, I think. But I think some of these people, Bryan Caplan is an economist who has given what I think is the most serious and interesting economic analysis of the problems that higher education faces. And then Noam Chomsky, who's, of course, a great intellectual product of the system, but a great critic of it. He thinks it's the students are essentially going through a process of being forced into a sort of lockstep process, and then they all march into jobs in finance and creating apps in Silicon Valley rather than doing good things in the world. And then Peter Thiel, the bête noir of HE, of course, I've thrown him in here because I think he's given one of the most scathing attacks of higher education. And I think it's interesting, no matter what you think of him, to use that as a foil. And then Harold Wilson and Jennie Lee. Jennie Lee, one of my favourite people ever in the series, we've discussed her before, who really founded the Open University and tried to break the system, or at least modernise and democratise it. Whether that's worked or not is up for grabs. And then finally, Paul LeBlanc, who's looking seriously, had great success at Southern New Hampshire University in the US, one of the biggest in the world, by shifting it online. But also is now very active in looking at the role AI can play in universities. So I've tried to get a bit of a mixture here, not be uber critical or uber utopian about the whole thing. Try and drive through the middle somehow.
So let's kick off with Bryan Caplan, born 1971, born in California, USA. Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a leading libertarian thinker. And I'm discovering through this series that there are probably as many varieties of libertarian thought as there are libertarian thinkers. He's also a former contributor to the Freakonomics blog. His book, The Case Against Education, 2018, argues that schooling is largely about signalling rather than skill acquisition. He believes much of what is taught is forgotten and economically useless. Caplan is a self-described open borders advocate and once wrote a graphic novel about immigration policy. Not a very popular subject nowadays. Interesting guy, Donald. What does he mean by signalling? Where's he coming from in his takedown of higher ed, and what influence has he had?
Yes, so his book, The Case Against Education, I think is essential reading in this area if you're interested. I think it's a seminal text in the whole area because he breaks down higher education into, well, he asks a really serious question, actually. Let's start with the question. It's almost a taboo question amongst educators. Could it be that we have too much education? Now, this is a really interesting question. It doesn't mean to say we shouldn't have no education, just that we perhaps have a surplus of the wrong type of education. In other words, we're spending our money ill-advisedly on education by focusing too much on higher education. That's the question he asked. That's a brave question. Now, he's an economist, and his main premise here is that the evidence, and it's a very evidence-based book, data-driven book, is that about 80% of a degree is signalling. And signalling is a technical term in economics, where you attribute value to the mere presence or signalling. It's a bit like putting a post-it note on your head saying, I went to Harvard, I went to Oxford, hire me. In other words, it's the pure signal in itself has economic value, as opposed to the real, actual economic worth of that education. Now, he thinks that the other 20%, he's not sort of dismissing higher education. He thinks the other 20% is incredibly useful. In other words, you get your degree, and you really do genuinely learn things that will be of benefit to you, both in your personal life and perhaps in making a living, in many degrees, vocational degrees, like medicine and so on. So 20% good, but 80% signalling. Now, the interesting thing about the concept of signalling is it is literally a cheat. It's almost a waste of money. In other words, huge 80% of the funding on that side, on teaching and tuition, may in fact if his premise is true, be a waste of money. Okay? Because it is nothing but the sticker on your forehead. And by prolonging schooling in people, every kid has to do a master's degree now, when the economic evidence suggests that it doesn't raise their productivity, nor enriches their lives. That's another thing he tackles in the book. He's really skeptical about the whole, yes, it gives us all critical thinking. He thinks that, like Chomsky, it does the very opposite, actually makes you conform to that peer group.
You get groupthink coming out of it, yeah.
That's right. He's very strong on that in the book. It's not just about pure economics. And then he has, I think what's great about the book is the pieces of it, the strands of evidence he pulls together. For example, a good contemporary one is the prevalence of cheating. Cheating has gone through the roof because the massification of higher education has meant that the students see it as a transaction. They're there to get this degree. Within a few months in the first year, they see it as a few lectures a week and an occasional essay or whatever. And so they just try and get through the thing. And of course, along comes AI and allows you to cheat at almost no cost, and it goes through the roof. But he thinks that in itself is a signal of what's wrong with the system. Why are they doing this if they're there for an intellectual journey? Another one is that the final year, so there's a kid I know who works for my son who has an £80,000 student debt and no degree. And the reason for that is he became incredibly ill in the final couple of weeks of his final year and copped out. So, and Caplan makes a very interesting observation is if you do that, then it proves that signalling is worth, because that £80,000 is absolutely worth nothing to him because he does not have a degree. Apparently, the 4 years up to that point are worth nothing because you don't have the piece of paper. And, in other words, that final exam is worth more than all the previous years. And then his final one is the rising graduate underemployment, and unemployment. And that's got really interesting. Since he wrote the book, you found that, for the unemployment rate for college graduates in the US has risen by 30% since 2022. So just over 2.5 to 3 years, it's gone through the roof. Compare that to only 18% for all workers as a whole. So there's clearly a trend in which this signalling has been counterproductive, because even with a signal, they're not being employed. So it's a heretical claim. I mean, that's the thing about this. It's heretical to say we should spend less on education, but he really is saying, let's take billions out of higher education and spend it on something else. It would be better spent on alleviating poverty. Vocational learning is a big one. He thinks we should absolutely swing the needle towards that because we have massive skills shortages everywhere. And then just to finish off that one, he says something really interesting, which is, he said, well, it's an easy win for politicians to say they're going to spend more on education. But at what point would education spending become excessive? Where's the end point? When do you saturate a system and it becomes counterproductive? It's a really interesting question. He thinks we passed that long time ago by funneling money into higher education. And of course, the cost has gone through the roof. The cost of getting a degree now has risen much faster than any other item that one might spend in your lifetime. Perhaps a house would be the nearest example. So I think time and time again, he uncovers all these studies which show that are rather shocking to people who have that innate belief that it's always a virtuous thing, higher education, because the evidence would suggest otherwise.
Yeah. What I wonder with this is, okay, some really interesting insights come out of looking at education from the point of view of an economist, and the kind of inputs and the outputs, and increasingly, since the 80s and Reaganomics and Thatcheromics, we've been inclined to look at kind of people who going through the education system as potential units of economic productivity, rather than thinking that there is kind of some kind of big value in education just for its own sake and making better citizens. I don't necessarily agree with that neoliberal take on education, but it really is the prevailing kind of wisdom on it. But is he being perhaps a little reductive in just focusing solely on the economics of it? I mean, there's a lot in education about social cohesion, about and so on. Is there something it just feels there's something slightly naive to me when you say, why would people pay to send their kids to private school? Well, you know why, because they're going to not hang around with people in gangs or whatever the prejudice is that middle class parents have. It's looking at something that is very kind of sociologically complex, purely from an economic point of view. Is it naive, reductive?
Well, that's the charge, certainly, and I think it could be. I think there's some truth in this, but actually, if you read the book with some care, he also tackles that whole, what is the purpose of education? Is it just for life? In other words, well, that's fine. If you think it just makes us better citizens, then why is all the money funneled towards the people who've already got all the money,
Yeah.
and the
Okay.
rest get nothing? You think you want to spread your largesse around the whole population if you had a democratic Dewey type view of the world, but that's certainly not happening. So the whole system, in England, for example, why do you send your kids to get to private education to funnel them into university? And then has it produced these wondrous, independent, objective people, or has it produced a graduate class that looks down on that other 50% because they voted for something they disagree with? And you see that everywhere. There was a very interesting example I saw that this week, which was ALT, which is a sort of trade association for higher education in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
Had an open education conference in London in June, I think, and it was all about can we fight back against populism? Are you kidding me? In other words, we have academic conferences now who are quite explicitly hate people who vote for reform. And in other words, they hate people who vote for anything that's slightly different from them. It's an academic conference. It's not a political conference, but it's intrinsically political. So I think he doesn't really. I don't think he's guilty of this, because if you get down to the nitty gritty and real examples of this, one might say that teaching Latin is worthy in some weird sense, some atavistic sense in the school system, but I doubt it. I think it's more to do with the signalling and the mark that you're a middle-class kid who did, a Latin GCSE, and that helps you get into Oxbridge or whatever. I think it's nothing to do with enriching lives. I think other examples he points to is learning languages. He said there are the huge sums of money that are spent on teaching kids to learn a second language, and they can barely order a cup of coffee in that language after years and years of study in the classroom. He said, that's not reductive. That's just a waste of money. He's saying that money could be much better spent on health, or indeed other forms of education, let's say vocational education. So I don't think he's wholly. I mean, he also goes down into things like mathematics. He thinks it's a bit of a waste of time teaching everybody algebra because they will never use it. And it's this myth of the transferable skill. Oh, if you learn algebra, you'll be really brilliant as a critical thinker. Well, not quite. It doesn't quite work that way. So I think he thinks there are many subjects that are notoriously irrelevant, even in life, even just as learning experiences, as enrichment experiences.
Yeah.
But there's certainly an instrumental view, rebooting of vocational education, and it's easy to say, but it's very easy to say when your kids went to university and your class go to university, but it enriches life, when everybody else has to pay for it. So let me give you an example. I have twin boys, as you know, John, you know them.
Mm-hmm.
Carl and Callum, one went to university and one didn't. Why should the guy who didn't go to university, that's Carl, who now runs a business very successfully, hiring graduates, why should he pay for this, for the 3 or 4 years of partying and self-enrichment for the other half? It makes no sense to him. And he argues he's a smart lad, and he argues eloquently about this. He thinks the whole system is skewed towards a certain class, effectively. And he doesn't see why he should be paying for that. And at the same time, he can't find employees with the necessary skills to make way in the world. And so he's in a sense a Caplan fan without having read Caplan.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's opened a lot of cans of worms, and kicks us off with the subject pretty well, I think. This podcast is supported by World of Learning Conference and Exhibition. L&D professionals, you need to be at World of Learning, the leading L&D event happening this 7th and 8th of October at the NEC Birmingham, UK. An unrivaled opportunity to learn, discover, interact and network. Register for free today at learnevents.com. Noam Chomsky, born in 1928, still among us. So I think he's 92 now. So, yes, I'm not sure what kind of health he's in. I think it's been a bit dodgy. Chomsky was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA on the 17th of December, which will ever after be celebrated, of course, by lovers of the movie Captain Fantastic, and very few others, I suspect, as Noam Chomsky Day, certainly in the diary in our house. Chomsky is a professor known for his work in linguistics, analytic philosophy, cognitive science, and political criticism, probably more heard on the latter subject nowadays. But he revolutionized linguistics with his theory of generative grammar and became one of the world's most prominent public intellectuals. He critiques the role of universities in supporting elite power structures and suppressing dissent. Fun fact, Chomsky wrote his first article on the rise of fascism at the age of 10, which is an interesting one. So Donald, Chomsky's name often comes up in our programs.
Yeah.
First time I think was in relation to B.F. Skinner, who he kind of took down. But tell us about his critique of higher education.
Yes, well, I mean, Chomsky's an interesting figure, a real internationalist, and with a really deep interest in politics. And he, like Caplan as well, I mean, a number of people have pointed towards this, that higher education, the promise of higher education, it would enrich society and lead to both, in a sense, almost spiritual and educational growth and economic growth. The economic growth thing has been pretty much dissed. And even the World Bank, there's a very famous article now in the World Bank field by Lance Pritchett called "Where Has All the Education Gone?" Because it looks as though most economies have got, the more higher education you have, Europe's a good example and the UK is a good example, the more we spend on it, the more stagnant the economy seems to become, which is rather odd in a way. And indeed, we recently had the Draghi report, for example, in Europe, showing that actually higher education has been a big blocker or stopper on economic growth in Europe. And he's pleading with the Economic Union to change their views on this. In other words, the myth is that lots of entrepreneurial stuff comes out of universities, but actually it doesn't. That seems to be false in Europe and in the UK, interestingly. And big economies like China, South Korea, Japan China's a good example, didn't build, now the second biggest economy on the way to being the first, had nothing to do with building higher education. And the same in South Korea. It had to do with a completely different set of drivers. The same is true in Singapore and so on. So I think Chomsky has I think people like Chomsky and Caplan have a very nice international view of the world. But going back to Chomsky. Now, Chomsky is one of those people who he's got out of favour a little bit here, but he's absolutely, perhaps his universal grammar has been dissed a lot, but he was one of the first to really force through this idea that the mind is not a tabula rasa, in other words, we don't have a sort of blank slate, Pinker style, upon which we learn language and impose everything upon it. He thought that there was that sort of prior dispositions towards learning language in his case. And although he's not a Marxist, Chomsky, far from it, and he hates continental European philosophy that was built upon Marxism. But he does think that higher education is by and large turned into a process of indoctrination, and that's the word he often uses. He thinks students are basically indoctrinated, a bit like the episode we did on Gramsci and Althusser and Habermas, where society and institutions very specifically shape the minds of young people. And he thinks that's happened through coercion and control. And he's saddened, as am I, that, we have a system that suddenly, spent huge sums of money in educating people, and then they all went funneling into finance and consultancy jobs in the city, or went off and started building stupid apps over the last 20 years in that sort of Silicon Valley technological escapism.
Stupid apps like Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. So what did all these people do with their lives? Did they solve the problem of climate change or poverty? No, they didn't.
Or cancer, yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. They didn't. Actually, what they did was make things worse in many ways, created these growth problems. The business schools encouraged outsourcing, and therefore that's why we have Trump. And one would argue that the same thing would be true of Brexit and 1,000,001 examples across Europe of what they call the far right, but is actually just ordinary people who feel disenfranchised by a system that's missed them out. Higher education sailed over their heads. It's not their kids. as the woman in Newcastle famously said, it may be your GDP, but it's not mine. So I think Chomsky is interesting because he's also a massive critic in education of its this ties in with Caplan's notion of signaling with assessment. He thinks that actually the whole thing is turned into a series of preparations for tests, and that the test is everything now, the getting of that certificate. And that was not what it was historically. And I must admit, when I was at university, I don't think it was. I didn't get the feeling that that's what it was all about. When I speak to people now, it very much is all about that target, the exam and the test. And it was what he thought had been sacrificed, had been genuine search, inquiry, discovery, the intellectual journey. Caplan makes a very interesting point on this, which is, if it's all about the intellectual journey, why does hardly any student in history of higher education go to another lecture on another subject? It's a very interesting question, that. You could walk in, you could go over to the philosophy department and sit in on that lecture on Kant, but nobody does. Because it's a transactional, they're making you wear that suit and not this suit. They're very departmental, very siloed, which is very different from the medieval university, which is why I quite like the liberal arts tradition in the US and went to university there and enjoyed that experience. I think Chomsky thinks that's been lost, the notion of free, independent, autonomous thought. He thought that's gone out the window. And so he warns us, and he's right to, he warns us about the threat of either commerce influencing it or the state. He thinks the state's far worse because they, by and large, fund a lot of higher education. Now, I'm not too sure this is entirely true, and it's dangerous. You can easily exaggerate this, but...
And all generalizations have exceptions, don't they? I mean, I went to hardly any of the lectures in my last year that I was supposed to go to. Because I found the lecturers who were good and hot and exciting, and they were kind of on different courses, really, and I went to theirs instead.
Yeah. Well, that's unusual. I think you're one in a million there, John, but most people just don't go. So the empirical evidence...
I don't know. Peter Thiel did the same, I think, to a degree. I mean, people do.
No, I don't think. Well, honestly, I don't think they do. That notion that students bat off to other lectures and other subjects, that's not borne out by the evidence. In fact,
it's probably less. I mean, this is back in the 70s. And of course, it all changed when suddenly you're paying with a whacking great student loan for your own education. You want to feel that you're going to earn better as a result. So maybe people stick to the guide rails there a bit more.
Yeah, well, no, it's very different now with the massification. In fact, so to stick to the sort of data on this, really, that by and large, about 40% of students don't turn up to lectures at all. This legion across the whole system, and that you can go to Harvard. And in fact, the key study was done in Harvard. They put GoPro cameras and all the they found the lecturers were lying. This is a really interesting study. They found that when they compared that data with what the lecturers said in terms of attendance, the lecturers tended to bump up the numbers to look good. But if you look at it objectively, about 40% of students after about 6 months in the first year tend not to attend lectures. That's interesting because, as I often say, if you're running a restaurant, people had paid a huge sum of money up front, which is what the government does in England. They give you a student loan, and therefore you have to pay it off, and you don't even turn up for the meal. You go, my God, this food must be terrible. We don't do that. Now, that goes back to another figure here, whom we've covered, and that's Wilhelm von Humboldt, who imposed the Prussian system, which meant the researchers had to be teachers. They're not very good teachers, so students don't turn up for lectures. So the cake has failure built into it, as it were. That dream of an intellectual journey doesn't get realized because the teaching is often below par, and students quickly suss that. You sussed it, I sussed it, almost every student who's ever gone to a university susses it, and either doesn't turn up for certain lectures or lectures at all, or finds alternative ways of learning. And increasingly, of course, that can be done online. My son, who did a degree in AI, did most of his learning by online, because that's where all the great minds in AI exist. They weren't in his university, but increasingly that's what is happening now. Now, I suppose going back to Chomsky, I think the interesting thing about Chomsky is he still believes in higher education, but thinks it should change course back to those core values, and we shouldn't be relying on it for massification. And just like Caplan, most of these serious critics of higher education think it's got too bloated, too big, out of control. It's now delving. You got a degree in any sort of weird and wonderful subject around the periphery, golf green management or whatever, and in the humanities especially, it's become politicized into all sorts of weird threads. And he thinks this has been a mistake. It's fraying at the edges because it's become too big and is too well funded. That's the view of these people. And I think there's something very interesting here about, these people. What's happened over the last 20 years in technology, we've had technological escapism. Along comes AI, we'll touch this later, which suddenly does something very serious and intellectual. When you're using a chatbot in AI, you're not using it, you can use it for trivial purposes, but it's not like porn, social media, or whatever. It's a serious endeavor, and that's how people treat it. So I think we're heading towards a different world. But before we leave that, of course, we have a really serious critical of higher education coming up next, so we can do that before moving into the
Before we
positive.
leave Chomsky,
Sure.
would you say, I mean, it sounds a little bit as if what he wants is a kind of return to Enlightenment values when it comes to education, the intellectual inquiry side of it. And we are heading to someone now towards someone who basically thinks that things went wrong at the Enlightenment. I mean, it's explicitly said this. The Enlightenment was where it all went wrong. So let's move on to the next great mind. He said through gritted teeth. Peter Thiel, born 1967 in Frankfurt, West Germany. Thiel emigrated to the United States as a child and also lived for a while in South Africa. I mean, we won't go into his schooling in South Africa, but it's an interesting and formative part of his background. But there's so much interesting about Thiel. He studied philosophy at Stanford, where he attended the lectures of René Girard. I don't think he was on that course, but Girard had a big influence on it. We shouldn't confuse him with Giraud, we covered last time. Girard had a big influence on him. He had this theory of the scapegoat, which is an interesting and quite complicated thing, can come across as a bit of kind of Christian exceptionalism. And Thiel is a Christian of some sort. A tech billionaire and co-founder of PayPal, Palantir, Founders Fund, among many other companies, part of the PayPal mafia, as it were, an eminence, grease, and influence on all that generation of tech oligarchs, you have to call them now, who are very much at the center of the kind of Trump second administration project. He's a vocal critic of higher education's value proposition, which we're discussing very much. His Thiel Fellowship pays students to drop out or not to go to university at all and build startups instead. Thiel was Facebook's first outside investor, putting in $500,000 in 2004 for a 10% stake. 10% stake for Facebook obviously being worth an awful lot more than that now. Although some people say he's a crap investor because he got out of Facebook too early. Donald, I've had a great time reading about Thiel, and I come across him a lot through listening to the All In podcast and various other things. Fascinating person. Nothing I've read makes me like him. But this is not a popularity contest. What is his beef with higher ed, particularly, and does it move our understanding onwards in any way?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I was listening to you give your your reaction to Thiel is very interesting because it's absolutely the dead center reaction of almost every middle class person in the world, almost. Because he's a thorn in your side a little bit, isn't he? Because it betrays a truth here that people who like higher or who have been through the higher education process are amazingly politically skewed. Now, let's not be evaluative on this, but they are absolutely skewed towards the sort of left liberal side of the spectrum. That liberal, I mean, in the European sense, not the American sense. It gets very confusing, this, as opposed to libertarian. And I think, in a sense, that sometimes blinds people to what these people are saying. It may be politically different from you, but he says some interesting things, and he's certainly been a massively successful business person. I mean, Musk is the new Peter Thiel, really, isn't it, I suppose? But it says something about the idea that higher education thinks it's subjective, but it's not really. It's
Yeah.
massively skewed towards one side of a political spectrum, which is now in opposition to what most voters think.
Could
Most
I
voters are
tell you,
voting
Donald,
against it.
what I don't like about Thiel, though,
Yeah,
because I
sure.
think it's a bit less knee-jerk than that. Um, my background is I came from the left, went to a very lefty university, but I've spent most of my life in business. I've got a great deal of respect for entrepreneurial spirit in companies, and I've benefited from that. I've been in startups, and I've drunk the entrepreneurial Kool-Aid, as
Yeah.
everybody who went through the dot-com revolution did. And I get that. I've got no objection to capitalism. What I have got an objection to is monopoly capitalism. And Thiel actually, as an article of faith, believes that monopolies are the way to go. He, on a YouTube video I saw where he was interviewed with the Hoover Institution, of which I think he sits on the board. He was saying that Stanford is useless in its business school because it teaches people to compete, and people in business shouldn't compete. They should look to absolutely wipe out all competition and start a company like Facebook that has no competitors, because it wipes them out, moves into other countries where it is the default way to access the internet. So you have a complete lock-in. This is, to me, is one of the worst sides of capitalism, that it does that. And I think it's worth reminding Americans that one of the reasons that the Puritan fathers left England to found that state was because of the abuses of monopolies handed out by the monarchies. And it's partly what the Civil War was about. So that's what gets my goat.
Well, so
Rant over, sorry.
Yeah, no. That's a reasonable. I think that's a reasonable charge, but I don't think it's right, by the way. So what you get are these, I suppose, almost tropes about people like Thiel and Musk, which, if you actually read what they've written, so his most popular book, and it is a really good book called 0 to 1. And what he's saying is he doesn't believe in monopolies at all. The very opposite. What he's saying is the gaps in the market so he thinks that the whole MBA type thing, they all go into finance and really speculate using other people's money. They're a waste of time. They're destructive in terms of positive capitalism, in terms of a raising tide for everyone. Now, he thinks that the paradox of entrepreneurship is that, that what is the formula for entrepreneurship? Well, it's not doing what everybody else does, because you're not going to get innovation that way, anything that's new and unique. You have to move into a territory that's empty and look to dominate it. And then he absolutely does not believe in monopolies. He believes that in antitrust laws, for example, and believes that these should not be allowed to dominate. But in moving forward, like AI, for example, you have to really push in areas to get the large investments to do amazing and innovative things. Then you get a whole ecosystem like the internet, and we're doing these podcasts, for example, for free for people to listen to on the internet as a function of that. So the mistake is taking it too far with Thiel, saying he believes in some sort of, absolute Chinese Communist Party state or private sector monopolism. He doesn't at all. He really does believe in competition. He just thinks that if you're an innovative entrepreneur, you shouldn't be doing what everybody else does. You should be doing something entirely different and trying to dominate that gap in the market because nobody's there. That creates new things like AI, rather than creating similar things that compete with others. And and that goes back with what he thinks about higher education. He thinks higher education doesn't do a good job here at all because, like Chomsky, he thinks it marches all these kids lockstep into doing the same old stuff. Going to work in consultancies, going to work in finance, going to work in tech companies that don't do much other than technological escapism. He really does believe that's the mistake, and he wants to steer people towards being much more independent and autonomous and free thinkers. And in that sense, he's a real hardcore libertarian. Doesn't see much role for the state in all of this. And that's where one could argue with him if you're on the left, certainly, as I am.
He's into seasteading and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, these are libertarian. But, I think it's very important that we keep a broad church and diversity of thought as well, because it's almost as if, if you mention Musk or Thiel the old cross and garlic comes out. Wow, we can't possibly discuss him. And you get that with Peter Thiel. Well, Peter Thiel was before Musk, of course. Musk has taken that mantle on. But I think what's important is what they say. And what I found really fascinating about Thiel was his, and it's something we've discussed a lot here, was his likening of higher education to the Catholic Church. It was a very interesting piece of work, that. With Alistair MacIntyre, the famous moral philosopher, has just died, wrote a whole book on this. He thought that higher education had lost its way because it had lost its roots in that sort of religious search for truth, and it had become massively siloed, departmental, relativistic, and was sort of floundering around the place looking for a purpose. But Thiel was very interesting because he had a very clear view of this analogy with the Catholic Church. It's worth untangling because I think it's sort of right in a way. And you have this sort of priestly class of professors, who don't really do a hell of a lot, I know that's a terrible thing to say, but compared to people who are up at 5 o'clock in the morning picking up your bins, in a sense. But what you have to do is go to them and buy indulgences. This is interesting, the pre-Reformation comparison here. We have to get that piece of paper, and we have to pay a lot of money for that piece of paper. We have to amass an enormous amount of debt for that piece of paper in order to get this form of secular salvation, which is the diploma or the degree. Now, if you don't pay up, you don't get that diploma, that indulgence, you're damned. This is mirrored by the sort of modern idea that if you don't get a degree, you're sort of damned as a failure. You're not part of the normal upper strata of society at all. You can't get into it because graduate employment really matters. And to get gainful employment and, importantly, wealth, you have to be part of that group. So I think it's a very interesting metaphor because it sort of matches what higher education, what happened. Alistair MacIntyre says this. He said it was rooted in this search for truth, but now has become relativistic. Thiel turns that on its head a little bit.
Yeah, it's historically quite accurate if you look at the kind of the way that universities developed out of the monastic tradition as well.
Indeed, yeah. That's scholasticism. That's correct, yeah. But the Reformation was an interesting point. And then he says something which I like the line of. He said, if you criticize higher education on this basis of you're buying a degree for signaling whatever, it's like saying there's no Santa Claus. You just can't do it. It's impolite in polite society, especially amongst people who send their kids to university, of course, because they've already paid top dollar to go through the process. And he thinks commercially that's a feature of all bubbles. He thinks wherever groupthink takes over, then you have a set of absolute beliefs, almost deontological beliefs that higher education is always good and everybody should have it. Education in Blairite terms. He thinks there are massive negative consequences to this, as does Caplan. At what point does that become ridiculous? At what point does that bubble become so bloated, soaks up so much resource, time and effort among students and society and government spend that it becomes counterproductive? Yeah. And now, like Chomsky, he really did believe that the bubble was fed by the sort of vague abstraction that education, that one word is everything.
Yeah, it's interesting that how similar a place he comes to as Chomsky from a very different angle. Yeah. You mentioned a name there, which will propel us forward, which was Blair, because we're now kind of headed into the heart of the Labour Party, which really came into its own in the 60s. So Harold Wilson, 1916 to 1995, and this is a twofer. Also Jennie Lee, 1904 to 1988. Harold Wilson, who's the first Prime Minister of the UK that I was really conscious of, I must admit, growing up, was born in Huddersfield, Yorkshire. And Lee was born in, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Donald, so you can put me right, Lochgelly, Fife,
That's right.
Scotland.
Well done.
Got pronunciation right for change.
I'm actually sitting north of Lochgelly at the moment.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so you've returned to the place of Lee's birth, almost. As Prime Minister, Wilson committed to the white heat of the technological revolution, aligned with Lee's vision for educational equity. Together, they spearheaded the creation of the Open University in 1969, bringing higher education into homes via TV and postal learning. The postal part of it is very important and quite often not neglected. Wilson was one of the youngest Oxford dons of the century at 21, lecturing in economic history and quite brilliant. And a lot of invidious comparisons are made with the person who followed him as Prime Minister, Heath, who really wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer in academic terms, and a rather unpleasant person. The Queen loved Wilson, according to the Crown anyway. At 24, Jennie Lee became the youngest woman MP in the House of Commons when elected in 1929. So, by the time I was conscious of these people, they all looked pretty old, but they were the sort of young prodigies. Donald, if you mention the Open University to me, I have a mental image of a bearded academic in sandals, eating muesli, talking about test tubes on a BBC TV programme in black and white late at night. But the Open University was really quite revolutionary, wasn't it? Really quite something.
Yeah, it was. And these are two great people, I think. Harold Wilson, incredibly smart, intellectual Prime Minister. I don't think we've had anybody as smart in that role since, who changed British politics, I think, for the better. But more importantly, Jennie Lee, who is a huge, huge heroine of mine. And she came from a similar background to me, small mining villages in Scotland. I know that world well, working class, blah, world, And she had a real spirit of innovation about her as well. But she was a really feisty, fighting sort of woman, You didn't mess with her at all. She reminded me a lot of my mother, I should say. Now, Wilson actually set the scene here by making a speech in Glasgow, interestingly, which she heard and she picked up on it and went to him and said, I want to do this, let's do this. And the idea was right. So it was using postal service, but primarily television and radio broadcast to provide the education. So that was a key thing. It was the first major use of technology in education funded by the state on a very big scale. Okay. And the aim was not to attract traditional students, but the people who didn't go to university. So, and her white paper is quite simply brilliant because it has the whole vision and the operational plan in it. This broad initiative to it was part of modernizing the white heat of technology was a big phrase at the time, as you remember, John.
Yeah.
Broader initiative to modernize British society and embrace an expanding economy, greater equality of opportunity and social mobility. That was what Jennie Lee and Wilson were all about. Now, I don't think higher education has done that, to be honest. Now, the Open University comes along, opens the first students in 1971, but the white paper was amazing because it didn't mention research at all. Jennie Lee was smart. She thought if it just starts to become a traditional university, it won't fail, but it won't do what it says it does, and that's enfranchise those who don't go to university. Now, the Open University is the biggest university in the UK. Get on for, your 190 to 210,000 students, just like the big universities in the United States, Southern New Hampshire with LeBlanc, and we'll come to him shortly. But the interesting thing is the fight she had. She gets the white paper out, and in great British fashion, the senior officials in the Department of Education and Science, the civil servants, fought like crazy against this. Why?
Oh.
Because they're all Oxbridge graduates and they want to protect the world in which their sons and daughters go through. And she hated them with a vengeance. She thought they were she thought they were almost the enemy of democracy in a sense. Even her own departmental boss, this guy called Anthony Crossland, you may remember that name.
Oh,
he
yes.
fought against it because he was one of the posher sides of the Labour Party who, again, when people come through that higher education system, they think that's the norm. It's their kids, and anything that threatens it, their antibodies come out. Ministerial. There are people like Richard Crossman, all sorts of other people, and all the commercial broadcasters that hated it as well, of course. So she had, against massive opposition, she got out the battering ram and charged. And it was her absolutely unwavering determination to get this through with the support of Wilson that allowed the Open University to happen. Traditional institutions, universities hated it, didn't want to happen it, fought against it because they saw it as a threat, which it was in a sense. But it had an amazing effect because literally since 1971, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have got degrees by not being in an institution at all, but doing it at a distance.
Yeah.
like post-television, radio, and then, of course, eventually the web and online. And you'll find I gave a presentation on the AI University to the Open University quite recently, and you'll find it will swing towards that as well. The great effect of the Open University was it was the first really on the planet, and it influenced Open University in Israel. There's one in the Fern University at Hagen in Germany, Open University in the Netherlands, in India, Open University in China started in 1979, Canada, Spain, all sorts of places. It had this massive global rippling effect. They did make a mistake, and the Open University spent $20 million going into the US, which disappeared down the plug hole because they weren't. I mean, they were never going to work. They weren't commercial enough to make that success. And also this disastrous foray called FutureLearn, a MOOC company that failed miserably and eventually was snapped up for next to nothing. So I think it's been a rocky road because they did what Jennie Lee didn't want them to do. It tried to mimic a traditional university by building research departments and so on and so forth. Remember that failed attempt at a rocket that disappeared without trace and so on. So I think that was the big mistake. Nevertheless, I tip my hat to the Open University because I think it still does a sterling job. I think in my lifetime...
It's still going as well.
Oh, yeah, and massive. People don't understand it. It still is the biggest university by a golden mile in the UK in terms of the numbers of students.
I'm always coming across people who went through the Open University in learning, particularly.
Absolutely.
And particularly benefit to people who would find access to higher education difficult, traditionally, like kind of mothers returning to work and, women in general, I think.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's the key point here. And that sort of brings us to, our next one, because I think that initiative, 1969, a long time ago now, and we've had other things like John Sperling, founder of University of Phoenix. That was back in the 1970s, interestingly, just after the Open University, 1971. First student, 73, University of Phoenix. We've had various attempts at this, but now we're seeing real success with people like LeBlanc in New Hampshire and several US universities as well.
Before we get on to LeBlanc,
Sure.
in a wider focus, how did these two revolutionize higher ed in the UK and beyond? I'm kind of conscious of the fact, without being sure exactly why, that I benefited as somebody from a state grammar rather than from public school in higher education, in that things seem to get easier for people from that sort of background during the 60s. Was it the influence? I mean, did they have a revolutionizing effect on higher education in the UK at all beyond the Open University?
Well, I think it did. I mean, the Labour governments did, because there were certain policy moves around student grants and so on, support for working class people like me. I was on a full grant at university.
Yeah, me too.
And I think all of that helped. That's sort of gone now because we sort of barely means test anything now. But I think it also had a cultural effect. So suddenly in the UK, university, and I remember watching those things late at night, on BBC Two, on Euclid or whatever. The university was suddenly on your television screen. It became part of popular culture, and it was on the radio. And we still have things like In Our Time and so on the radio and that tradition in the UK. And I think
podcasts like this one. Yeah.
Sorry?
And podcasts like this one.
Podcasts like this, yeah. But I think it democratized and gave vision to that type of higher education and made it seem, listen, you too can do this. And that's what literally millions of people have done since 1971.
Yeah.
Its influence on the rest of the education system has been absolutely nil. In fact, they treat it with some disdain and disrespect, I feel. And I think that's a mistake, because I, like you, have employed people from the Open University who've always been very interesting people because they've been self-driven.
Yeah.
They didn't just default into going for 3 or 4 years and getting drunk through university again. And they actually worked hard to achieve what they achieved. I've been involved in a number of big initiatives in online learning, right through to, giving people the degrees at graduation. And you see people and their parents in tears because they know the amount of effort and work that it took. As an older person sometimes, say a woman with a child who's getting a degree in X to further her chances with her and her child and her family. I remember in Edinburgh Castle handing out degrees with some of the girls there had come from Africa. They could only afford to send one parent, and they were weeping, and that's incredible. But what have we done? We've actually made the rest of the system as elitist as it's ever been, paying top dollar, prices going through the roof. And those who are most in need of education have never been further away from it. So much money is spent on the already wealthy that the rest are being abandoned. And we have all this political strife now. We have, you go into any sink of street and you'll see those lads around street corners because they have been abandoned. Nobody cares about them. They're just the problem. They're the people who steal your phones, because vocational education has been stripped bare. And try getting a plumber. Try getting somebody who can critique Macbeth. That's easy. They live next door. There's hundreds of them in your street. Try getting a plumber. That's difficult. Something has gone badly wrong here. Badly wrong.
We have a plumber who lives on our street, and I have the sense that he's a reform voter, actually.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if I were him. I'd be voting reform as well.
Plumbers earn more than a lot of traders, actually.
Yeah. Well, they have a point. I know a lot of those people in my family, a lot of them traders, and they have a very, people of our ilk tend to see everything as the far right. And if you don't vote with me, if you don't vote for the EU or whatever, you remember the far right. But these are ordinary people who are in the majority in the country, and higher education, in a sense, is very distant from them. But they are smart enough to see that it's taken a lot of resources that perhaps should have been spent, some at least should have been spent on their children. And so let's not be surprised if they don't vote for the parties you like. It constantly amazes me that people don't ask why people are voting for parties that have a certain anti-HE view when the answer is staring everyone in the face, really. Yeah, I think.
Widely covered on other podcasts. Let's move on. Paul LeBlanc, no birth date available, born in, but still among us, born in Lewiston, Maine, USA. LeBlanc is president of Southern New Hampshire University. Under his leadership, SNHU became one of the largest online universities in the US, serving mostly working adults. He challenges traditional models for being inaccessible and outdated, and he promotes flexible, student-focused learning. LeBlanc's early education was in a French-speaking community, which is why I'm calling him LeBlanc rather than LeBlanc, and he was the first in his family to attend college, as was I, although I was the first Helmer male in 3 generations not to go to private school. So, Donald, what was LeBlanc's contribution to the debate, if I get his name right?
Well, it's interesting because I think I like Paul LeBlanc because he both did it for real. In other words, he built an institution from almost nothing up to 200,000 students, by and large, by implementing technology and online techniques. But he also has it very grounded in a theory of education, if you want to call that. So his first book, Students First, is excellent. And it really tackles those big words which people, diss a little bit about equity, access, and opportunity in higher education. In other words, who gets there? And he's saying, well, most people don't get there and they have no chance of ever getting there. I'm just back from Tanzania and Zanzibar, where actually every single young person I met has not a cat's chance in hell of getting into higher education because they're poor. And they were born in the wrong country, place, time. But that book really does lay a challenge on the table and saying higher education has not fulfilled its promise of equity, access, and opportunity at all. And there's a brilliant chapter in the middle of the tipping point guy. What's his name again?
Gladwell.
Gladwell's new book, which I bought. It's a great chapter in the middle of that.
It's a good book.
Yeah, about Harvard, where 30% of students that go to Harvard.
Yes, women's rugby.
Yeah, I remember I read the chapter. I thought I knew a little bit about higher education. 30% of the students are sons and daughters of faculty or donors or do obscure sports that white people are encouraged to play to get into Harvard. The idea that's equitable is far from the truth. But going back to LeBlanc here, I think the great thing is that he actually did this. And in building up an institution which did exactly the same as the Open University in the UK and opened up opportunities for non-traditional learners, let's not try and caricature them by saying what they are or who they are. The simple fact is that the SNHU LeBlanc transform, it went from 2,500 students, 2,500 in 2003 to 200,000 students in 20 years.
Wow.
It's a massive achievement because of the switch of delivery to online. Now, he had a link into the US Navy, which helped, and all sorts of things here. But now, let's face it, he did it. But I mean, there's now 200 odd accredited undergraduate, graduate certificate type stuff through that institution. What's interesting about Paul is he's not resting on his laurels. Having done that, he's now looking seriously at how AI can take us further down that road. That's why I've kept an interesting eye. So he and George Siemens are building a platform, an AI platform that he hopes will help us reimagine the whole of education. And I think this will happen. It may be LeBlanc and George Siemens, it may be others, but I certainly think something is going to happen here, because I think AI is the sort of straw that's breaking the camel's back here a little bit. Suddenly you have super intelligence that's available for next to nothing or free, available globally to anybody with a smartphone. People know this. There isn't a student on the planet that isn't using it now, whether to learn or very often to cheat, because they see the whole thing as the system's a bit broken and transactional. So I think Paul is an interesting figure here and symptomatic of what's happening, rather than being the key figure who's driving this forward. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't there an odd thing that emerges when you look at higher education, that a lot of what the teachers are doing is actually hiding knowledge from students, in that it surfaces in the kind of debate about cheating. That the whole point about the way it works is that they kind of go in a lecture theatre and throw knowledge at you, and then they have to hide the knowledge from you so that they can test whether you got it or not. And so a big part of their job is actually kind of hiding knowledge. Am I being too kind of veil of ignorance about this? But
I think that there's some truth in that. I mean, every generation of academics, I remember the academics in my university blaming the new generation of students as being dumber than the previous. It's sort of, that's just the norm. In other words, if there's a problem, blame the students. Never blame faculty for being poor teachers, or why are people not turning up to your lectures? Just blame the students. But there's something deeper to this, I think. And there's a really nice little book by Joseph Fiskin on this called Bottlenecks, A New Theory of Equal Opportunity. It was written in 2014. I really like this little book because it's opened my eyes up to maybe deeper cause here. And Fiskin tries to show how institutional bottlenecks limit people's access to education, subsequently employment, even economic mobility. Inequality is one outcome, but so is productivity on the back of this. So these bottlenecks, and higher education is a bit of a bottleneck. The education system is like smashing your head against impervious layers of rock as you go up. Your GCSEs, you've got to get through that layer of rock. Your A-levels, you've got to bash through that one. You've got to get into a good university, you've got to bash through that one. You've got to get a degree. At every point, there are bottlenecks which narrow and narrow and narrow down to a very interesting, desirable thing for many people politically. And I think actually the new left fall into this trap. They think that sort of funneling to an elite is a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing at all, because almost everybody I know in both of my families are not part of that world. Yet all politicians are now graduates. They all come through this research essay writing world, tend to do nothing but write endless reports that go nowhere. There seems to be very little action amongst that group of graduate politicians. But I think Fiskin's book on bottlenecks, what he says in the book is interesting. The one massive bottleneck is this rigid reliance on credentials, especially elite university degrees. Test scores, the gateway for high productivity jobs, when we know actually that is an economic mistake. Because there are many talented people who just get thrown to the side out of that. They just can't break through that impervious layer of credentialism. A good example are dyslexics, and I give lots of talks on AI. Can't tell you how often the first person who rushed up to me afterwards wants to speak to me is someone who incredibly bright, perhaps eventually got a degree when they were in their 30s or 40s, but failed on every exam because they were dyslexic.
Yes.
And so there's all sorts of
My
bottleneck.
brother, case in point, was dyslexic and
Interesting,
didn't
yeah.
pass 11 plus. We kind of got through that. The other end of the scale as well, you do wonder whether, going to elite university in the UK, Oxford or Cambridge, getting a good degree, is your route into financial consultancy or a financial services operation? Because that does seem to be the only place you can make money in Britain now.
Yeah.
And you're wondering if this is a really useful thing, that people have a kind of liberal arts education in an ancient university, and they go into the financial sector. And you see so many of this among my kind of children's generation, that they go into a bank, they earn a shitload of money, they have a nervous breakdown, and they
That's
go and
right,
do
yeah.
something else, go work as a nanny or or as a social worker or as a psychotherapist or something. And you just wonder if that is really the way that you kind of, enrich the company through education. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's a good point.
Anyway, we
Increasingly,
should move to summing up, actually, Donald, because we're kind of getting into that mode.
yeah,
And
sure.
I do, I like the chapters. We don't want to drift into it. So summing up, how do we sum this up? In many of our episodes, we've charted a progression over the years of views on a certain topic. You get opposing viewpoints, they clash. Synthesis coming out of thesis and antithesis in a very Hegelian way.
Yeah.
You get battles fought or won or lost, positions abandoned, and some sort of consensus even rarely gets achieved, but something comes out at the end of it. But do these thinkers show that sort of pattern? I'm not sure that I can see it, if there is, or if it's just a lot of critiques coming from very different angles,
Yeah.
not always showing much relation to one another. What's the story, do you think, here? Where's it got us?
I think they're all.
I mean, I'm also
Yeah.
conscious, Donald, I think I should say that there's slightly an elephant in the room, because you talked briefly about the crisis that education is in, and it is in a terrible state of crisis, higher education at the moment. And we kind of haven't talked about that. It's not really within the purview of this. I just think I ought to kind of mention the fact that we do know it's happening.
Yeah, I would hope that, I don't want to give the impression that we should dismantle higher education. I think that would be a disaster, but I think we should certainly maybe deflate its conceits and get it back to its original purpose, perhaps, which is that Chomskyan idea of an area where you can go and become more of an autonomous young person, and it opens rather than closes your mind. Most of these people are saying, well, actually what it does is just close your mind and funnels you into either a job in finance or a sort of lower rung middle management job. Let's not pretend that it's what it's not now. And then most people try desperately to get through the degree process by cheating, not, whatever, And is there a solution to this? And I think Paul LeBlanc and others have given us a signal here of the way this is going. I think AI, in a sense, is is a challenge, a provocation to the system. They really can't deal with AI. And what they want to do is pull the drawbridge up, sit in the ivory tower and hope it goes away. And of course it will not. It's like a rising tide. It's flooding right over the parapet, as it were. There's nothing they can do to prevent this from happening. But it's a massive challenge, because suddenly you have these incredibly intelligent things, AIs, let's call them, that perhaps can teach you incredibly well. They have a degree in every subject. They can teach you in any language, deal with your foibles and weaknesses and dispositions as a learner. This is a real challenge. Why should I pay hundreds of thousands of pounds? Well, of course, as Caplan said, you could do that for the signalling. Or perhaps we should go back to a more democratic view of all this, to ensure that everybody gets a chance here. So the AI vision here, you want to go like a little bit of an AI manifesto around how AI could alter and help higher education democratize itself and become more appealing. Then I think, first of all, you've got to really look at non-traditional students and widening it out to people who have no access to that level of education. Okay? Because we clearly do have critical skills shortages that in every the more money we spend on higher education, the more critical the skill shortage is in things like nursing, plumbing, whatever become. But I think what's interesting about Paul LeBlanc's approach was we should look at a model that has an intake at any time. Why should I wait till September? Why don't we just loosen this up and make sure that a student can join at any time during the year, make it really quick and easy to apply and enroll? That's what Paul LeBlanc did. That's what Sterling did at the University of Phoenix. And it was not this ridiculously long-winded go for an interview with a Don at Oxford, which absolutely guarantees exclusion of working class people. And then you start using the full range of these amazing generative AI tools, which are as smart as humans in many domains, whether it be coding, writing, media production, full, multimodal aspects of it all. Personalized learning, of course, is a big feature of this. Some great minds like Karpathy and so on are building systems like Eureka that will do that. Multimodal from the start, and I think higher education is guilty of the fact that it's drowning in a sea of text, I've said this often, you send your kid off to school and they come out 20 years later and what have they done? All they've done is read, write and critique text. We abandon any form of practical education or anything other than that. And perhaps the multimodality of AI will help here. But I think, every teacher can have a 24/7, a digital twin that is as good as them, available all for any student to talk to, that notion. But also teaching at different levels. I've been involved in projects over the last year where we've taken very high academic teaching in healthcare and repurposed it in seconds using AI down to a more vocational level for nurses, especially nurses who have English and Dutch as their second language. So AI can actually, in a sense, get the right level of teaching in a way teachers traditionally have not in higher education. They very often go over the heads of students. Of course, you can teach in as many languages as you want. I've just come back from Africa, and AI's inroads into African languages has been astonishing. Most of the major languages are covered, and many of even languages that don't have any text corpus, are being snapped up by AI. But this notion of AI being a key part of building any curriculum and all the assessments and that. And you can complete this at your own pace, like the Open University. There's no, you have to do this in a year, 2 or 3 years. It's modular in that sense. And you do the assessment when you're ready. I mean, so many students I hear, well, oh God, I failed my exam. I've got to go back in a year's time to reset the exam. That's crazy.
Spend another year at it, yeah.
Crazily expensive and a waste of a year of that person's time, and a more data-driven approach, but of course with privacy ensured. And also a very low admin, high teaching and learning establishment where you massively reduce the costs because you're stripping out all the admin, all the bureaucracy can be automated using AI. So I think all of these things point towards an analogy I like to draw, John, is the Library of Alexandria, which is a much older precursor to this vision, where Ptolemy the First just gathered all the knowledge in the world, just got it all, put it in one big library and just opened the door and said, get on with it. And what happened? We got Euclid. We got an absolute explosion of people like Archimedes and so on in engineering. We got loads of things happening, an absolute blooming of intellectual wonder at that time. It was shut down by the Christians, by the way. Didn't get burnt down, but that's interesting. And I think that's the sort of vision we need here.
Yeah.
A more communal, big picture vision of how AI can really help us across the whole educational spectrum, but specifically in higher education, because it's intelligence on tap, which is what a university used to be. It was intelligence on tap. Then it became intelligence on tap, but only if you paid a hell of a lot of money to get access to it. Now we can get access to intelligence for next to nothing. Do we need all that money to be spent on very privileged access for tiny numbers of people in lecture halls to rare academics? I'm not so sure we do.
Yeah. I wonder if kind of AI in a way is another attempt to solve that Library of Alexandria problem that happened kind of with Google. That in a way it did that, opened all the knowledge of the world to everybody.
Yeah.
But you had to find it. It's as if we'd kind of got all the knowledge of the world in one place in a building.
Yeah.
And we'd said, the librarian said, well, we've got this problem. People say they can't find the books they want. So, okay, we need something more than the Dewey system, and you create a system that allows people to find what they want and everything. But with Google, that's not what happened. You got a system where people had to pay to be found in advertising, and this has progressively over time meant that Google has become less and less usable. I mean, it's a process that people now give the technical word of enshittification
Yeah.
to any kind, and this kind of happens. I'd blame Peter Thiel. You'd say maybe not, and it's like, is that going to happen to AI? Are we more optimistic about AI not going that way? I mean, what would stop it? It has to be monetized.
I think that is a very, very good question, John, because the last 20 years since the birth of the internet was dominated on search by Google. And of course, most people use Google for free, and therefore that's a good thing because you get the economic surplus, of, oh, it's free. And most people don't really care about the fact that a little bit of their data is being used for advertising, but it does
Well, they
enshittify
didn't. They're starting to care more.
Well, I think that most young people, we're all using it, aren't we? We're all using social media, and we're all, because you have a choice of just not using it, but most people do because the economic value to them is so much greater than the data issue, as it were. But I think you posed an interesting problem. I think what makes AI different is it's not been technological escapism, all that, social media, simple Google search, the whole porn, OnlyFans weirdness of it all. Gaming, all that sort of stuff. The sort of narcissism of it all. And there's a very good book called The Technological Republic that brought this to the surface for me, and people won't like it because it's written by the chief executive of Palantir, but he makes a very good point that this artificial intelligence movement is entirely different. And that it's fronted by, what are those 4 billion uses in February? What were they? People are not saying, can I have an e-learning course? Can you give me a lecture? They're actually learning. They're getting things done. They're finding it productive, useful, enlightening in a way that no other form of technology has before. Not only that, it has already solved great problems in science, like the 200 million proteins from AlphaFold, digital biology that's coming out of DeepMind, and many other things in science, useful things. It may very well prove to be the most significant help in solving things like climate change, and I think economic inequalities, especially in education, where we've had this oil and water separation of the graduate class from the rest. And that's interesting, but it's front end, which you asked for. I think a really good example of this is Duolingo, which is 100% an AI product now, and Louis Van Aan, the guy behind it all, has made sure that that's true. But, the 500 million people in that, what are they doing? They're learning a language, and they're trying, they're motivated because agency has been given back to the learner. You don't have to go to an institution. You don't have to be at a certain place at a certain time to listen to a certain person. You can get this 24/7 intelligence 24/7, but it's fronted. It's interesting about, I gave a keynote at a conference recently on English teachers from all over the world in Edinburgh. I went down to the conference hall and there was one little stand and it was Duolingo. They were worth 14 billion market cap, revenues of $1 billion, and they had the smallest stand on the floor. Because they understand that the world is now online. You don't have to be at this conference or exhibition hall. The real winners are out there with a global presence. And having just come back from Africa and talked to a lot of people who are the real buzz around Starlink, for example, with no blind spots to any place at a reasonable cost. I know people hate Musk, but, the fact is that's what they're discussing. And that's of more interest to me than the sort of, little, well, I hate him because he gave a Nazi salute at some conference there or whatever. I think what really matters is action on the ground. And I think we have a confluence of AI, global access and connectivity, because almost everybody in Africa now has a cheap smartphone. It used to be really text-only type thing. So I think we're reaching out into areas of the world that we've never managed to reach out before. But what we're going to do, build a university in all those little towns in Africa? Or are we going to take this route? Well, I think that's a no-brainer.
Do you think residential university courses are basically going to die, wither on the vine?
Well, that's the great attraction, of course.
No sign of it at the moment.
Yeah, well, we England is very unique in that sense, in that it's called the dormitory system. We have that notion, the middle class. Well, we live in Brighton. Almost all how many parents have you seen their kids shoot off to Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, on a little holiday to working class cities in the north for 3 or 4 years, and then come back to London or the southeast again? The dormitory system is an interesting aspect of a sort of, coming out type parade for middle class kids in England, but it's a very English thing. If you go to America, for example, the state universities are very often where kids in that state go to. It's much more localized. Scotland's a good example. I never thought about going to an English university. I went to the one that was closest to me, which happened to be Edinburgh. And that's very true of Glasgow University. People brought up Glasgow very often go to Glasgow University. So I think we need to go back to that. That dormitory model is incredibly expensive. And you have that whole Erasmus thing where you're flying literally thousands of rich kids all over Europe to attend other universities in other countries, completely against the whole climate change premise. I think that's a busted flush in many ways. When I can have access to somebody in Stanford, I can have access to Geoffrey Hinton, if I'm studying AI, I'm thinking of my son here. He was watching stuff from Jan LeCun and Geoffrey Hinton and Andrew Nagin and all those people all over the world. It had nothing to do with where he was at that point.
But that has been the case for quite a while now, for 10, 20 years, ever since YouTube started, whatever. Residential still seems to be in place. I've got another question I really want to ask you about higher education before we come to a close. And that's is there a paradox here between, we want to widen access to higher education. That's been a theme of this all the way through. And this is something that the Blair government kind of managed to do. They massively widened access to education up to a certain point. But you then get the point where kind of nurses and plumbers, nurses have to have degrees, plumbers do courses on critical thinking, as you say. And really, we should have more focus on vocational education. Is there a kind of paradox between those, or not so much paradox, but two forces there that kind of have to be balanced, or are they in contradiction? That that there is widening access on the one hand, on the other hand, we don't want everybody to be kind of having to write essays and critique essays.
Yeah, that's a great question to end on for the following reason. We've talked about higher education here, but most middle-class people think of higher education, it's better called tertiary education or post-16 type, post-18 education. If you think higher education is just universities, you're riding the wrong horse here. You're riding a horse towards it. You're pulling the cart of elitism, really. Higher education should be much wider. I'm absolutely against widening access to universities. I think we should be changing the shape of tertiary education and taking a whole lot of money from universities and shoving it and spreading it more evenly across the educational opportunities on the other side. So, perfect example you gave were nurses, and I've said this often, my sister and mother were nurses. They could no longer be nurses because they were working class women who didn't have university as an aspiration. It wasn't part of their mindset. They wouldn't have been nurses if it had been a degree subject. And that's why we have these massive shortages in these areas. Working class women have been shut off from certain professions, which has been a complete disaster. That happened as recently as 2013. What we need to do is widen the concept of tertiary education, because not everybody wants to go and read novels and critique Macbeth. Some people genuinely want to become nurses and plumbers, and there's 101 things in the middle. It's a whole spectrum here. Not everybody wants to hold a placard and be an expert in critical thinking. And I had a bizarre podcast I gave recently, and after the podcast, I was speaking to someone who was recommending that plumbers go on critical thinking courses. And I thought, we've reached the absolute sort of nadir of thinking about this if we think that's even remotely interesting or useful as a proposition.
That's brought us back, I think, to where we ended up on the last one as well, because we don't necessarily want to repeat that, because we are, after all, as Carl Hendricks says, building a really valuable body of work here. So, a little pat on the back for us. We've graduated from the University of Life with that piece of feedback, and we hope you'll come along and join us on the journey for the next time.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. We'd also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this season.